Voyager One is the fastest object humanity has ever launched beyond the planets. It has been flying for nearly 50 years at 38,000 miles per hour. In November of 2026, it will finally reach one light day from Earth. That is one single day out of the 1,500 that light itself needs to reach the nearest star. At Voyager's speed, that crossing would take over 70,000 years. And Voyager carries no crew, no life support, no fuel to slow down. It is a metal whisper fading into an emptiness so vast that every propulsion concept humanity has ever imagined barely scratches the surface of crossing it. The stars are not simply far. They are walled off by physics, energy, and time. That wall may never come down. If you want to understand why the universe may have built a permanent barrier around every civilization that will ever exist, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It truly helps this channel grow. Now, let's begin. Every generation believes it will be the one to reach the stars. Look at the trajectory. In 1969, humans walked on the moon. By the mid-1970s, robotic probes had crossed the asteroid belt and sent back the first close-range photographs of Jupiter's swirling atmosphere. Within a decade, Voyager 2 had swept past Uranus and Neptune, revealing ice giants no human eye had ever resolved in detail. In the early 2000s, rovers crawled across the rusty plains of Mars, drilling into ancient rock, analyzing soil chemistry, searching for molecular traces of vanished water. In 2015, New Horizons completed a 3 billion-mile journey to reach Pluto and sent back photographs of frozen nitrogen plains and mountains of water ice standing at the dark frontier of the solar system. Every decade brought another leap. Every mission demolished a boundary that the previous generation considered permanently beyond reach. The assumption that follows from this pattern feels irresistible. Give humanity enough time, enough funding, enough engineering brilliance, and the next destination after the outer planets will be another star. Perhaps not in this century, perhaps not in the next, but eventually, interstellar travel sits at the edge of the human imagination like a promised land, waiting for a sufficiently advanced civilization to claim it. The movies reinforce this belief. The novels assume it. Scientists who dream of cataloguing exoplanet atmospheres speak of reaching those worlds as though the only missing ingredient is a faster engine and a bigger fuel tank. This belief is seductive. It feels earned. It draws a straight line from the Apollo program through the Mars rovers and the Pluto flyby to a glittering interstellar future. And it says the arrow has always pointed outward. But this belief contains a hidden error so fundamental that most people who hold it have never been forced to confront it. The error is this: every mission humanity has ever flown, every probe it has ever launched, every boot print it has ever pressed into alien soil, has taken place inside a single tiny neighborhood of space. The moon sits 1.25 light seconds from Earth. Mars, at its closest approach, drifts about 3 light minutes away. Jupiter orbits at roughly 43 light minutes out. Pluto, at the frozen rim of the solar system, floats at a distance of approximately 5.5 light hours. Every achievement in the history of human spaceflight, without exception, has occurred within a radius measured in light hours. The nearest star is not measured in light hours. It is measured in light years, and the gap between those two units is not a gentle slope. It is a cliff so sheer that no spacecraft ever designed, funded, or built by human engineers has come anywhere close to scaling it. The nearest star beyond our own sun is Proxima Centauri, a dim red dwarf sitting approximately 4.24 light-years from Earth. 1 light-year equals roughly 9.5 trillion kilometers. Multiply that by 4.24, and you arrive at a distance of approximately 40 trillion kilometers. Written out fully, that number stretches across 14 digits. It is a distance so enormous that the human brain, which evolved to track predators across open grassland, possesses no intuitive framework for processing it. The number sits on the page looking impressive and conveys almost nothing. But this distance can be made real, and once it is, the dream of reaching the stars begins to fracture. In September of 1977, NASA launched a small spacecraft from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It was called Voyager One. Its original mission was straightforward: fly to Jupiter. Voyager One. Fly to Saturn. Photograph their moons and cloud systems at close range. Send the data home. Voyager 1 accomplished all of this with spectacular success before continuing outward on a trajectory that would carry it beyond the planets entirely. It was never designed for interstellar travel. It carries no advanced propulsion system, no fusion reactor, no experimental drive of any kind. After its encounter with Saturn in November of 1980, it received a final gravitational kick from the planet's immense mass and has been coasting ever since. Moving at approximately 17 kilometers per second relative to our Sun. That translates to roughly 38,000 miles per hour, fast enough to cross the continental United States in about 5 minutes, fast enough to reach the Moon in under 10 hours, impossibly, absurdly fast by any human standard of motion. Voyager 1 has now been travelling for nearly half a century. It crossed the boundary of the heliosphere, the protective bubble of charged particles generated by the Sun, in August of 2012, becoming the first human-made object to enter interstellar space. As of mid-2026, only 2 scientific instruments remain active aboard, a magnetometer and a plasma wave detector, both powered by a decaying lump of plutonium that loses roughly 4 watts of electrical output every single year. The spacecraft is slowly running out of time, but before it goes silent, Voyager 1 will reach a milestone that NASA has formally confirmed. On November 18th of 2026, at 2:16 in the morning Pacific Standard Time, the spacecraft will sit exactly 1 light day from Earth. That means a radio signal travelling at the speed of light, the absolute fastest that anything can move in this universe, will require a full 24 hours to reach it. A command sent by engineers on a Monday morning will not receive a response until Wednesday morning. The most distant human-made object in existence has travelled so far from home that a simple conversation with it now consumes 2 entire days. This milestone sounds extraordinary, and in one important sense, it absolutely is. Voyager 1 has outlasted the Cold War, the birth of the Internet, and the entire arc of the digital revolution. It was assembled with computers less powerful than a modern greeting card, and it is still returning scientific data from beyond the edge of the Sun's domain. But here is what that milestone actually means when set against interstellar distance. 1 light day is approximately 26 billion kilometers. Proxima Centauri sits at roughly 40 trillion kilometers. After nearly 50 years of continuous flight at 38,000 miles per hour, Voyager 1 has covered approximately 1/1500th of the distance to the nearest star, less than 0.1% of the crossing. The probe has been flying since before personal computers existed, and it has barely left the front step. At its current velocity, Voyager 1 would require approximately 73,000 years to reach Proxima Centauri. 73,000 years. To place that figure in human time, consider that 73,000 years ago, Neanderthals still walked the Earth alongside our species. The most recent ice age had not yet reached its maximum extent. Agriculture did not exist anywhere on the planet. Writing would not be invented for roughly 67,000 more years. The entirety of recorded human civilization, every empire, every revolution, every scientific discovery, every war, fits inside the most recent 5,000 years. Voyager would need to fly for 14 times that span before it arrived. And Voyager carries no crew, no life support, no food or water or breathable atmosphere, no shielding against galactic cosmic radiation, no fuel to slow down at the other end. It is a metal shell roughly the size of a compact car, weighing approximately 800 kilograms, carrying a golden record and a handful of aging instruments. It is the fastest interstellar traveler humanity has ever produced, and it is hopelessly, laughably inadequate for reaching another star in any time frame that has meaning for human beings. This is the first fracture in the dream. The fastest object we have ever thrown toward the stars would take 73,000 years to arrive, and it is not even trying to arrive, it is simply drifting. The reason Voyager's timeline sounds absurd is not that Voyager is slow. Voyager is fast. The problem is that interstellar distance occupies a fundamentally different category from the distances human spaceflight has conquered. This is not a difference of degree, it is a difference of kind. Inside the solar system, distances are denominated in astronomical units. 1 astronomical unit equals the average distance from Earth to the Sun, roughly 150 million kilometers. Mars orbits at about 1.5 astronomical units. Jupiter sits at approximately 5. Saturn floats at roughly 9.5. Pluto drifts out near 40 astronomical units from the Sun. Proxima Centauri sits at approximately 268,000 astronomical units from our Sun. That figure bears repeating. 268,000 times the distance separating the Earth from the Sun. The nearest star is not 10 times farther away than Pluto. It is not 100 times farther. It is nearly 7,000 times more distant than the farthest major body in our solar system. The jump from planetary distance to interstellar distance is not a step up a staircase. It is the difference between wading into a pond and trying to swim across the Pacific Ocean. To make this visceral, consider a scale model. Shrink our Sun down to the size of a basketball and place it on a table in front of you. At this scale, Earth becomes a tiny grain of sand orbiting approximately 26 meters away, roughly the width of a tennis court. Jupiter becomes a marble drifting about 130 meters out. Pluto, at the outer boundary of the traditional solar system, shrinks to a barely visible speck of dust floating roughly 1 kilometer from the basketball. At this scale, you could walk to Pluto in about 15 minutes. The entire solar system, everything humanity has ever visited or explored, fits comfortably inside a modest neighborhood. Now ask where Proxima Centauri sits at this same scale. The answer is approximately 7,000 kilometers away. Not 7,000 meters. 7,000 kilometers. At a scale where you can stroll to Pluto in a quarter of an hour, the nearest star sits farther away than London is from New Delhi. You would need to cross entire continents and an ocean to reach it. Everything humanity has ever accomplished in space, every planet photographed, every probe dispatched, every boot print stamped into alien dust, occupies a 1 kilometer circle around that basketball. The nearest star demands a journey that spans the width of civilization itself. That is the category change. That is the cliff. This is why analogies to the history of exploration shatter when applied to interstellar travel. When European navigators first crossed the Atlantic, they were covering distances roughly 10 times greater than their longest previous coastal voyages. When Apollo astronauts reached the Moon, they travelled roughly 3,500 times farther than the highest altitude ever achieved by a crewed aircraft. These are substantial multipliers, but they are jumps within the same broad regime of achievable engineering. The propulsion systems of the era were strained by those distances, not obliterated. Interstellar distance does not strain existing propulsion concepts. It annihilates them. The multiplier between Pluto's distance and Proxima Centauri's distance is not 10, not 100, not even 1,000. It is 7,000. And that 7,000-fold increase applies on top of a baseline distance that already requires nearly a decade of travel using the fastest probes humanity has ever launched. The gap between current spaceflight capability and interstellar requirement is not a crack that a few decades of clever engineering will seal. It is an abyss. The instinctive human response to this scale problem is to demand a faster spacecraft. If Voyager is too slow, build something faster. This response feels logical, and it is the foundation of nearly every optimistic interstellar travel proposal ever published. But the mathematics of velocity and interstellar distance expose something deeply uncomfortable. Even enormous leaps in speed barely compress the timeline. Voyager One travels at roughly 17 kilometers per second. That is approximately 0.006% of the speed of light. Now suppose humanity constructs a propulsion system 10 times more powerful, capable of sustaining 170 kilometers per second. This would be a staggering engineering accomplishment, far beyond anything a crewed spacecraft has ever achieved. At this speed, the crossing to Proxima Centauri shrinks from 73,000 years to approximately 7,500. Still measured in millennia, still absurd, still longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization. Suppose 100-fold improvement, 1,700 kilometers per second, roughly 0.6% of the speed of light, exceeding any crewed spacecraft velocity ever achieved by more than a factor of 100. At this speed, the trip drops to roughly 750 years. A significant compression, but 750 years ago, the Black Death was devastating Europe. The printing press had not been invented. No single government, no organization, no institution currently operating on the face of the Earth has survived continuously for 750 years. A 750-year mission is not an engineering project. It is a civilizational wager that spans more time than most civilizations endure. Push still further, 1% of the speed of light, 3,000 kilometers per second, not achievable with any propulsion technology that exists or is currently funded for development, but grant it anyway. The trip takes roughly 424 years, still longer than the entire history of the United States of America, still longer than the gap between the Renaissance and the present day. The pattern is remorseless. Even revolutionary improvements in speed, improvements representing engineering achievements unparalleled in human history, reduce the travel time from inconceivable to merely impossible. The distance is so staggering that velocity alone cannot rescue the mission unless that velocity reaches a significant fraction of the speed of light. And approaching a significant fraction of the speed of light introduces an entirely new avalanche of catastrophic problems that this story will explore in brutal detail. The fastest spacecraft ever built by human hands, measured by peak velocity, is the Parker Solar Probe, which has reached speeds exceeding 190 kilometers per second during its close perihelion passes. But this velocity is achieved by falling toward the Sun under gravitational acceleration. The Parker Solar Probe could not sustain it on an outward interstellar trajectory. Even this record-breaking speed, hypothetically applied to a starward crossing, would still require more than 6,000 years to reach Proxima Centauri. The most ambitious near-term propulsion concepts under active development, including nuclear thermal rockets being studied by NASA for crewed Mars missions, improve on chemical rocket performance by factors of 2 or 3. Applied to interstellar distance, these advances compress the timeline from 73,000 years to perhaps 30,000. The order of magnitude does not shift. The timeline remains geological. No spacecraft currently in operation, under construction, or formally funded for development by any space agency on Earth can deliver a payload to the nearest star in fewer than thousands of years. This is not a failure of ambition or imagination. It is a direct confrontation with the scale of interstellar space. Scientists who study these distances use a term for them. They call them civilization scale. The word is precise and intentional. A civilization scale distance is one that cannot be bridged by any individual, any single generation, or any single phase of technological capability. It demands sustained effort across timelines that exceed the ordinary lifespan of governments, cultural movements, and frequently entire civilizations. Every distance humanity has crossed before was personal scale or mission scale. You could walk to the next valley. You could sail to the next continent in months. You could fly to the moon and return within a week. You could dispatch a probe to Pluto and receive results within a decade. These missions fit inside individual human lifetimes. The people who conceived them could reasonably expect to witness the outcome. Interstellar distance shatters this pattern completely. At any speed currently achievable, the journey to the nearest star takes longer than any single human life, longer than any dynasty, longer than any continuously operating political institution in recorded history. The mission would outlast its creators, their children, their grandchildren, and every organization that authorized the launch. By the time the spacecraft arrives, the civilization that sent it may have transformed beyond recognition, splintered into something unrecognizable, or simply vanished from the historical record. This temporal reality transforms the very nature of the mission. A voyage to Mars is a trip. You leave, you arrive, you return. A voyage to the nearest star, at any plausible speed for a crewed vessel, is not a trip. It is a permanent departure. The travelers do not go somewhere and come back. They go and they stay gone. They depart the civilization of Earth, and within a few decades of flight, they cease to be part of it in any operational sense. Communication delays grow from minutes to hours to years. News from Earth becomes old history by the time it reaches them. Emergency calls take years to transmit and years to receive a reply. For every practical purpose, the crew is alone from the moment the engines fall silent. Consider what this isolation means for the bond between the travelers and the world they left behind. When European explorers sailed to the Americas, they could return within months. Letters could be exchanged within weeks. Trade flowed in both directions across the same ocean. The colonies remained extensions of a parent culture, connected by commerce, language, and continuous communication. An interstellar mission severs every one of these links. There is no trade. There are no messages that arrive in fewer than years. There is no cultural continuity strong enough to survive a communication round trip measured in decades. The travelers become a separate civilization the moment the delay exceeds the natural timescale of human decision-making. And that threshold is crossed within the first few years of the voyage. This severance is not a side effect of interstellar travel. It is the defining feature. Any crewed mission to another star, regardless of propulsion concept, regardless of velocity, regardless of crew size, will produce a permanent schism in human civilization. The travelers leave and they do not return in any sense that matters to the people who watch them go. Even if messages are exchanged, those messages crawl at the speed of light and arrive years out of date. Even if the crew ultimately reaches a destination, the Earth they departed will have changed beyond recognition by the time confirmation of arrival returns. The mission is not exploration in the historical sense. It is irrevocable exile. A comforting counter-argument surfaces whenever these numbers are presented in public. Technology improves, the argument goes. It always has. The gap between the Wright brothers' first powered flight and the Apollo moon landing was only 66 years. Computing power has roughly doubled every 2 years for over half a century. Surely interstellar propulsion will follow a similar exponential trajectory. Surely future generations will crack problems we cannot even properly formulate today. This argument contains a subtle but devastating flaw. Historical progress in spaceflight has been a story of conquering progressively larger distances within a single physical regime. The Saturn V was enormously more powerful than the V2. The ion drive is far more efficient than chemical propulsion. But all of these advances operated within the solar system, where the relevant distances are measured in astronomical units. Not one of them was designed to bridge the gap between astronomical units and light years. Not one of them did. The reason is structural. Crossing the solar system demands velocities of tens of kilometers per second. Crossing interstellar space within a single human lifetime demands velocities of tens of thousands of kilometers per second, roughly 1,000 times higher, and the energy required to reach a given velocity does not rise gently with speed. At modest velocities, the relationship follows the square of the velocity. At relativistic speeds, it becomes enormously steeper. The kinetic energy of a spacecraft moving at even 1% of the speed of light exceeds the energy at current spacecraft velocities by a factor measured in the tens of thousands. This escalation is not an engineering challenge. It is a mathematical certainty imposed by the structure of spacetime. This is not a curve that technology can simply ride upward with better engines and lighter materials. It is a wall that physics erects, irrespective of how sophisticated the civilization becomes. No advance in computer design, no revolution in manufacturing, no breakthrough in material science can alter the fundamental relationship between mass, velocity, and kinetic energy. The equations are indifferent to ambition. They apply to every rocket, every sail, every propulsion concept ever conceived or yet to be imagined. The energy cost of speed is not a technological limitation waiting to be overcome. It is a law of nature. This means the comfortable narrative of inevitable progress runs into a ceiling that most people never perceive. Comparisons to the Wright brothers or the Apollo program are seductive but misleading, because those milestones operated in a regime where the energy costs were enormous yet surmountable by a determined industrial society. Interstellar travel operates in a regime where the energy costs can dwarf the total output of entire civilizations. The difference is not one of willpower or ingenuity, it is one of physics. None of this means that interstellar travel is physically impossible in every conceivable form. A tiny, lightweight probe accelerated by an external power source such as a massive ground-based laser array could conceivably reach a meaningful fraction of the speed of light and cross to Proxima Centauri in decades. This concept has been studied seriously by scientists at Caltech, the Australian National University, and other major institutions. Prototype sail materials have been fabricated and tested in laboratory conditions. The physics works for a gram-scale payload, but there is an immense and frequently ignored chasm between sending a microchip the mass of a paperclip on a one-way flyby and sending human beings on a journey from which they could hope to survive. The microchip needs no food, no air, no water, no radiation shielding, no psychological care, no way home. Scaling that concept up to a crude vessel is not a matter of building a larger version of the same machine. It is a matter of solving an entirely different constellation of problems. Problems rooted not in propulsion physics, but in biology, ecology, mechanical endurance, and the profound fragility of human life far from Earth. The outline of a trap is now becoming visible. It has two jaws, and they close from opposite directions. On one side sits time. If the spacecraft travels slowly, using propulsion systems that are at least theoretically plausible for large crude vessels, the journey stretches across centuries or millennia. The ship must sustain a functioning human community for durations longer than most civilizations on Earth have survived. Every biological system, every mechanical system, every social structure aboard must operate with near flawless reliability for timescales that exceed anything humanity has ever engineered or maintained. Food must be grown in artificial soil under artificial light. Air must be scrubbed, recycled, and rebalanced without interruption. Water must be purified and recirculated across centuries. Children must be born, raised, educated, and somehow motivated to continue a mission that was chosen for them before they drew breath. And all of this must succeed without a single catastrophic systems failure across hundreds of years of unbroken operation, with no possibility of external resupply or rescue from Earth. On the other side sits energy. If the spacecraft travels fast, compressing the journey into decades rather than centuries, the energy required rises so steeply that it exceeds the output of entire nations. The propulsion systems that would be needed for this do not currently exist, and whether they can ever be built at the scale required for crewed vessels remains an open and deeply uncertain question. But even if limitless energy were somehow available, high velocity introduces new and independently lethal hazards that are physically inseparable from the speed itself. The interstellar medium, harmless at low velocities, becomes a continuous barrage of high-energy particle impacts at a significant fraction of light speed. Shielding against this bombardment requires additional mass. Additional mass demands additional energy to accelerate. Additional energy requires additional fuel, which adds more mass, which demands still more energy. The cycle feeds on itself until the engineering becomes absurd. Between these two jaws there is no comfortable refuge. Every realistic velocity for a crewed interstellar mission inherits some crippling portion of both sets of problems simultaneously. Travel slowly enough to manage the energy demands, and the biological and mechanical endurance requirements become extreme. Travel quickly enough to keep the journey within a human lifespan, and the energy, radiation, and impact physics become brutal. No single velocity eliminates both sets of constraints at the same time. This is the fundamental architecture of the interstellar travel problem, and it is what makes the problem resist solution in a way that planetary exploration never did. Reaching Mars is difficult, reaching the outer planets is more difficult, but each of these challenges involves one dominant obstacle, usually propulsion energy or mission duration, that can be overcome with a sufficiently determined engineering effort. Interstellar travel does not present a single dominant obstacle. It presents a matrix of obstacles that interact with and reinforce each other, and relieving pressure on any one of them invariably increases pressure on another. What follows will map each jaw of this trap in unsparing detail. First, the slow crossing. What happens inside a spacecraft when the journey stretches across centuries, when time becomes the destroyer and every system aboard must outlast the civilizations that built it? Then, the fast crossing. What happens when speed itself turns lethal, when the energy required to push a human payload through interstellar space begins to rival the output of stars, and when the space between those stars fights back against every object that dares to cross it at high velocity? Each path promises an escape from the trap. Each path delivers a different form of ruin, and when both paths have been fully explored, the true shape of the barrier will emerge. It is not one missing engine, it is not one unsolved equation, it is a wall constructed from physics, biology, and time, buttressed from every direction, standing between every civilization born around a star and the light of the nearest neighboring sun. That wall has a name. It is called interstellar distance, and it may be permanent. The slow crossing appears to be the rational choice. If speed demands energy that dwarfs the output of entire civilizations, then accept the time instead. Build a vessel large enough to sustain human life across centuries. Let generations be born, grow old, and die aboard while the ship drifts toward its destination at a modest, manageable velocity. Science fiction has rehearsed this scenario so many times that it has come to feel almost inevitable. A vast rotating cylinder gliding through the dark, farms growing under artificial light, communities forming and dissolving as decades roll past, children born between the stars who will someday step onto the soil of a new world their great-grandparents never lived to see. The concept has a name. Engineers and scientists call it the generation ship. On paper, it solves the energy problem by surrendering to time. But surrendering to time means living inside time for the entire duration of the crossing. And time is not a neutral companion. It does not simply pass. It acts. It corrodes metal and degrades polymer seals. It accumulates tiny errors across millions of mechanical cycles. It breeds mutations in small populations. It erodes social bonds and frays psychological endurance. When the mission lasts months, these effects are manageable. When it lasts years, they become challenging. When it stretches across centuries or millennia, they become the primary threat to the survival of everyone aboard. Every problem examined here shares a single root cause. The journey takes too long for any system built by human hands, biological or mechanical, to survive without catastrophic failure. And catastrophic failure on an interstellar generation ship does not mean a cost overrun or a delayed schedule. It means the death of every person aboard, in the most complete isolation any human community has ever experienced, with no one coming to help. The first and most fundamental requirement of any slow interstellar crossing is total ecological closure. Nothing enters the ship from outside, nothing leaves. Every molecule of oxygen the crew breathes must be generated aboard. Every litre of water must be recovered, purified, and recirculated from what the vessel already carries. Every calorie of food must be grown, harvested, processed, and served within the hull, using soil and nutrients that must themselves be recycled from the waste of previous harvests and previous meals. There are no resupply ships trailing behind with emergency provisions. There are no orbiting depots where the vessel can stop to refuel. The nearest source of raw materials is the planet the crew left behind, and it recedes at hundreds of millions of kilometers per year. Within a decade of departure, even a distress signal takes years to reach Earth. Within a century, Earth might as well exist in a different universe. To appreciate how extreme this requirement is, consider that no human facility has ever achieved full material closure for more than a few months, even on the ground. The International Space Station, the most advanced crewed habitat ever built, operates in low Earth orbit and recycles a portion of its water and atmosphere, but it depends on resupply launches from the surface every few months for food, spare parts, fresh chemical cartridges for carbon dioxide scrubbers, and replacement filters. It produces no food aboard. Its atmospheric loop is only partially closed. It is, by interstellar standards, an open system tethered to the planet below. A generation ship would have no tether. Every material loop, air, water, food, waste, must close completely and stay closed for the duration of the crossing. With no external input whatsoever, this means the ship must replicate, in miniature and in metal, the essential functions of an entire planetary biosphere. It must cycle carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and water with the kind of reliability that Earth achieves through 4 billion years of evolved redundancy. Consider what Earth's biosphere actually does. It operates through interlocking chemical and biological cycles of staggering complexity. The carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, the oxygen cycle, each driven by thousands of species of bacteria, fungi, plants, and animals interacting across scales from the molecular to the continental. These cycles absorb disruption. When a forest burns, new growth recaptures the carbon dioxide. When a species disappears, ecological niches are colonized by competitors and successors. Earth's biosphere is robust precisely because it is enormous, ancient, and woven together by billions of years of coevolution. A generation ship possesses none of these advantages. Its ecosystem is minuscule. Its biological redundancy is thin. Its evolutionary history is zero. Everything aboard must function correctly from the moment the airlock seals, and it must go on functioning correctly for hundreds or thousands of years without the deep buffering capacity that only a planetary-scale biosphere can provide. There is no room for the slow, messy trial and error process by which natural ecosystems recover from disruption. Every failure must be diagnosed and repaired by the crew, using only the materials and knowledge they carry with them, while simultaneously depending on the ecosystem for every breath they take. They are servicing the machine that is keeping them alive. If they fall behind, the machine stops keeping them alive. To understand why this is not merely difficult but may be practically impossible, consider the most ambitious attempt ever made to test a closed ecological system on Earth. In September of 1991, a team of 8 people sealed themselves inside a structure in the Arizona desert called Biosphere 2. It remains the largest materially closed ecological facility ever built. approximately 3.14 acres of enclosed space containing 7 designed biomes: a tropical rainforest, a miniature ocean with a coral reef, a mangrove wetland, a savanna grassland, a fog desert, an intensive agricultural zone, and a human living habitat. The structure was sealed from the outside atmosphere. The crew was to live entirely on what the enclosure produced and recycled for 2 full years. Biosphere 2 had every advantage a generation ship would lack. It sat on solid ground with stable gravity. The Arizona sun poured through the glass panels, providing full-spectrum natural light for photosynthesis at no energy cost. The surrounding atmosphere offered a fail-safe in case of emergency. A full team of scientists and engineers monitored the experiment from outside the seal. Hospitals stood within driving distance. Replacement components could be delivered in hours. Earth itself, in all its biological abundance, served as the ultimate backup system. Despite every one of these advantages, the experiment began deteriorating within months. Oxygen concentrations inside the enclosure fell from the normal atmospheric level of roughly 20.9% to approximately 14.5%, a decline equivalent to suddenly living at an altitude of around 4,300 meters. The crew experienced chronic fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and impaired capacity for physical work. They were slowly suffocating inside a sealed building on the surface of the Earth. The cause was a cascade that the designers had not fully anticipated. Microorganisms in the enriched agricultural soil consumed oxygen at rates far exceeding projections, and chemical reactions between the humid internal atmosphere and exposed concrete in the structure's foundation absorbed additional oxygen while releasing carbon dioxide. The system's oxygen budget, which had been carefully modelled before closure, turned out to be wrong. Not because the models were careless, but because a real closed ecosystem generates interactions between components that no model can fully predict. The biological consequences spread rapidly. Most of the vertebrate species placed inside the enclosure died. All pollinating insects perished. Populations of cockroaches and certain ant species exploded unchecked, overwhelming habitats they were never intended to dominate. Crop yields fell short of requirements, and crew members lost significant body weight from sustained caloric deficit. Vines overgrew the rainforest canopy, choking off light to lower-level plants. The reef declined. The meticulously designed ecological balance, assembled by experienced environmental scientists using years of preparation, disintegrated under the weight of feedback loops and interactions that the designers had not foreseen and could not reverse quickly enough. Oxygen had to be pumped into the enclosure from outside. The material closure was broken. The experiment that was supposed to demonstrate the viability of a sealed human ecosystem could not sustain 8 people for 2 years on the surface of a planet with every conceivable backup available. As a demonstration project for space habitation, it was a sobering failure. As a warning about the fragility of closed ecological systems at small scales, it was among the most important experiments of the 20th century. Now scale this challenge to a generation ship, not 8 people but hundreds or thousands. Not 2 years, but 500 or 5,000. Not on solid ground beneath natural sunlight with hospitals a short drive away, but suspended in the vacuum of interstellar space, decades or centuries from the nearest possibility of help, bombarded by cosmic radiation, surrounded by temperatures near absolute zero, with no external atmosphere and no second chance. Every problem that emerged inside Biosphere 2 would be magnified by orders of magnitude aboard such a vessel. Every failure mode that caught its designers off guard would carry lethal consequences, and there would be no one standing outside the hull ready to pump in emergency oxygen. The difficulty here is not simply a matter of engineering a larger or more sophisticated version of Biosphere 2. The difficulty is structural. Closed ecosystems are inherently fragile at small scales. They lack the buffering mass of planetary systems, tiny perturbations, a fungal blight among staple crops, a population crash in a critical decomposer species, an unexpected chemical reaction between construction materials and the recycled atmosphere, can cascade into system-wide collapse faster than any human crew can diagnose and correct the problem. Earth absorbs these shocks because it holds an atmosphere massing approximately 5 quadrillion metric tons, oceans containing roughly 1.35 billion cubic kilometers of water, and trillions of organisms distributed across hundreds of millions of species. A generation ship has a thin envelope of recycled air, a limited reservoir of recycled water, and a handful of carefully curated species that must perform every ecological function the crew requires to stay alive. If a single critical link in that biological chain breaks, the entire system can spiral toward collapse before anyone fully understands what went wrong. It is the difference between disturbing a pond and disturbing a fish in a sealed jar. The pond recovers, the jar does not. Even if the ecological challenge could somehow be mastered, the crew itself introduces another layer of biological vulnerability. A generation ship does not carry a fixed team of trained astronauts who complete a defined mission and return to Earth. It carries a breeding population. Those people must reproduce. Their children must reproduce. And this cycle must continue without interruption for the entire duration of the voyage, potentially spanning dozens or hundreds of human generations. This immediately confronts the problem of genetic viability. A population that is too small will suffer from inbreeding depression within a few generations. Harmful recessive alleles that remain safely diluted in a large gene pool become concentrated in a small one. The incidence of birth defects rises, immune diversity narrows, fertility declines. The population weakens biologically at precisely the moment it can least afford weakness, isolated from any possibility of genetic rescue from the outside. How large must the founding population be? The answer varies with the duration of the voyage, the degree of genetic risk deemed acceptable, and whether the community enforces managed breeding protocols or permits free reproductive choice. Peer-reviewed studies have produced a range of estimates. A 2018 analysis by Frederick Marin and Camille Beloufi, modelling a 6,300-year journey, concluded that a minimum of approximately 98 founding individuals could sustain genetic health, but only if reproduction was governed by strict guidelines designed by population geneticists and enforced across every generation. Other researchers, using different models and less restrictive social assumptions, have estimated the minimum viable population at several hundred to tens of thousands. A widely cited benchmark for long-term genetic sustainability without centrally managed breeding is approximately 10,000 individuals. Think about what 10,000 people means for the architecture of a generation ship. Each person requires living space, food production capacity, potable water, breathable air, sanitation, medical care, education, governance, meaningful work, and some form of social and cultural life. They need laws, they need conflict resolution, they need institutions that sustain purpose and cohesion across centuries. The vessel that supports 10,000 people in a fully closed environment is not a spaceship in any conventional sense of the word. It is a small city encased in a hull, a city that must be entirely self-sufficient, entirely enclosed, and entirely self-repairing for the full duration of the crossing. The estimated mass of such a vessel, including structural materials, radiation shielding, agricultural zones, water reserves, power generation, and propulsion systems, climbs into the millions of metric tons. And accelerating millions of metric tons to even a modest interstellar cruising velocity requires precisely the kind of civilization-scale energy expenditure that the generation ship was designed to avoid. The solution circles back into the problem it was meant to solve. But suppose the population challenge could be resolved through some combination of genetic engineering, frozen embryo banks, or carefully enforced reproductive rules. The mechanical endurance problem remains, and it may be the most unforgiving of all. No machine ever constructed by human beings has operated continuously for more than a few decades, without significant maintenance performed using externally sourced replacement parts. Even the International Space Station, the most mechanically supported crewed vessel ever built, cannot maintain itself. Pumps fail, filters clog, circuit boards degrade, gyroscopes drift out of alignment. Every component has a service life, and when that life expires, the part is replaced by a spare manufactured on Earth and delivered by rocket at enormous cost. The station depends on a global industrial supply chain stretching from rare earth mines to clean rooms to launch pads, a chain that exists because an entire planetary civilization stands beneath it. Components that wear out on a Tuesday can be replaced by components launched on a Thursday. The station survives not because it is durable, but because it is reachable. It floats at roughly 400 kilometers above the factories that keep it alive. A generation ship has no such lifeline. Every replacement part, every spare valve, every circuit board, every meter of wiring, every bearing, seal, and fastener must either be loaded aboard at departure or manufactured during the voyage from raw materials that are themselves finite and irreplaceable. The ship must carry not merely its own infrastructure, but the infrastructure to rebuild that infrastructure when it fails, and it will fail. Metal fatigues under cyclic stress. Polymer seals harden and crack over decades. Lubricants degrade. Electronic components drift out of tolerance. Bearings wear. Structural joints accumulate microscopic fractures. Over years, these small degradations are routine maintenance problems. Over decades, they become systemic challenges. Over centuries, they become existential threats. Consider the oldest continuously operating machines on Earth as a reference point. A handful of mechanical clocks in European cathedrals have been running for 600 or 700 years, including the clock at Salisbury Cathedral, which dates from approximately 1386. But these clocks have survived not because they are indestructible. They have survived because they have been continuously rebuilt. Worn gears have been replaced, corroded shafts have been reforged. Virtually none of the original physical components remain. The clock persists as a design, a function, a lineage of replacement parts sourced from the surrounding civilization. It endures because it exists inside an industrial society that manufactures the materials it needs on demand. A generation ship exists inside no external civilization. It is the civilization. If a critical pump fails in year 400 and the crew lacks the raw material or the expertise to fabricate a replacement, the pump stays broken. If that pump circulated coolant through the primary power reactor, the reactor overheats. If the reactor overheats, the ship loses electrical power. If it loses power, the air recyclers stop, the water purifiers stop, the grow lights go dark and the crops begin to die. A single unrepairable failure in a single critical subsystem, at any point across a journey spanning centuries, can trigger a cascade that kills everyone aboard within weeks. And there is no way to predict which component will be the one to fail, or when, or whether the crew alive at that moment will possess the knowledge and the materials to save themselves. This fragility deepens with every passing decade in a way that resists even the most aggressive engineering countermeasures. Redundancy can be built in. Spare parts can be stockpiled. Systems can be designed for modularity and field repair. But every layer of redundancy adds mass, which increases the energy needed for propulsion. Every kilogram of spare parts displaces a kilogram of food production capacity or living space, and no amount of redundancy can anticipate every failure mode across operational timescales that exceed the entire recorded history of mechanical engineering. The designers must predict what will break 500 years from now, and ensure that the descendants of the original crew, people who may have lost critical technical knowledge through cultural drift or incomplete education, can identify the problem and fix it using only what the ship contains. No engineering tradition in human history has ever operated at that level of foresight. None has ever been asked to. Medicine and disease introduce yet another vulnerability that deepens with every passing generation. On Earth, medical care rests on an infrastructure so vast it has become invisible. Pharmaceutical factories, surgical supply chains, diagnostic laboratories, specialist training programs, and a global population large enough to sustain all of these simultaneously. A generation ship carries none of this. It carries a finite stock of medications that degrade chemically over decades. It carries medical instruments that wear out and cannot be replaced. It carries whatever surgical and diagnostic expertise its current generation of physicians possesses, expertise that must be transmitted intact from mentor to student across centuries without the support of universities or teaching hospitals. What happens when a crew member in Generation 15 needs emergency surgery and the last physician trained in that procedure died in Generation 12? What happens when the ship's supply of a critical antibiotic has been consumed or has expired beyond usability? Across timescales measured in centuries, these are not improbable edge cases. They are statistical certainties. Medical knowledge erodes when transmission chains break. Critical medications run out. Diagnostic equipment fails without replaceable parts. Epidemic disease poses an even more fundamental threat. A closed population of several thousand people, breathing the same recycled air, sharing the same water supply, living in unavoidable proximity for generations, creates ideal conditions for the emergence and rapid spread of novel pathogens. On Earth, epidemics are contained by geographic dispersal, immune diversity across billions of hosts, and external medical resources. A generation ship has none of these defenses. A single mutated pathogen arising naturally within the ship's own microbial ecosystem could sweep through the entire population with nowhere to quarantine effectively and no external source of vaccines or treatment. The sealed environment that sustains the crew also imprisons them with whatever emerges to threaten them. The social and psychological weight of a generation ship is equally severe and far less amenable to technical solutions. The founding crew presumably volunteers for the mission. They choose this life with open eyes. They accept the risks and the sacrifices. Their children do not choose. Their grandchildren do not choose. Every generation born aboard the ship enters existence inside a sealed vessel they never agreed to inhabit, bound to a mission they did not select, heading toward a destination they will never reach. These are people who will live and die inside a pressurized cylinder, breathing recycled air, eating food grown under lamps, knowing that the open sky and the green earth their ancestors described exist only in recordings and in the fading cultural memory of a world none of them has ever touched. They will never feel wind. They will never wade into an ocean. They will never walk through a forest that grew without human permission inside a metal hull. What happens to a society confined under these conditions for centuries? No one knows, because no human community has ever endured such total enclosure for such duration. The closest available analogues, Antarctic winter overstations, submarine patrols, isolated island populations, last months or a few years at most and involve groups of dozens, not thousands. Even these comparatively brief confinements produce documented psychological strain, elevated rates of depression, interpersonal conflict, social withdrawal, and motivational collapse. Submarine crews, who endure perhaps a few months of sealed confinement with a clear end date, already report significant stress responses. Antarctic winter over personnel, who know rescue will come with the next summer season, still experience what researchers call the third quarter phenomenon, a predictable collapse in morale roughly 3/4 of the way through their assignment. On a generation ship, there is no third quarter. There is no end date within any living person's lifetime. The confinement is absolute and permanent, not for the original volunteers who at least had a choice, but for every generation that follows. Extrapolating from these short-duration, small-group experiences to a multi-century, multi-thousand-person confinement aboard a sealed vessel in interstellar space is not a straightforward analytical exercise. It is an act of speculation piled upon assumptions, piled upon hope. The most probable outcome, judging from every relevant precedent in human social history, is that the political and cultural order aboard a generation ship would evolve in directions its founders never intended and could not control from beyond the grave. Governance structures would shift under pressures that no constitution can fully anticipate. Religious or ideological movements could emerge, fracture the crew into factions, and redirect the mission's purpose. A power struggle in Generation 12, a schism over resource allocation in Generation 20, a revolt against the breeding protocols in Generation 30. Any of these could cripple or destroy the mission as thoroughly as a hull breach. And unlike a hull breach, these failures cannot be prevented by better materials or thicker walls. They arise from the nature of human societies under extreme, sustained confinement, a condition for which evolution provided no preparation. Communication with Earth introduces a final dimension of creeping futility. Even at a very modest fraction of the speed of light, the ship's distance from home grows by billions of kilometers every year. Within the first few years of the voyage, the time delay for a radio round trip stretches from minutes to months. Within a few decades, it reaches years. The crew can still transmit, Earth can still listen, but the exchange ceases to be a conversation. It becomes one-way correspondence between strangers separated by a gulf that grows wider with every passing day. Questions sent today will be answered by people who were born after the question was composed. Advice arrives years after the crisis that prompted it has resolved itself or killed the people who asked for it. Within a century of departure, the cultural and technological gap between ship and homeworld may become unbridgeable. Earth's civilization will continue to advance. Languages will drift. Scientific paradigms will shift. Engineering standards will evolve. New art forms will appear that the ship's inhabitants will never experience. Political revolutions may remake Earth's societies several times over. The ship, meanwhile, becomes a time capsule, frozen at the technological and cultural level of its departure era, drifting through the void while the world it left behind races into a future the crew cannot share or even fully comprehend through the thin thread of time-delayed radio messages. This divergence creates a paradox that haunts every generation ship concept. If Earth develops a faster propulsion system within a century or two of the ship's departure, a possibility some optimists raise as an argument for patience, a later mission launched on more advanced technology could overtake the generation ship in transit and arrive at the destination first. The original crew and their descendants would endure centuries of hardship, sacrifice, psychological confinement, and irreversible biological risk, only to arrive and discover that faster travelers reached the destination before them, using engines that did not exist when they left home. This scenario, sometimes called the incessant obsolescence postulate, implies that launching a slow generation ship may always be premature because waiting a few more decades for better propulsion will always produce a faster crossing. And if that logic holds, the generation ship can never be rationally launched at all, because the next generation of technology is always just over the horizon. This is the slow trap laid bare. It is not one problem with one solution. It is a cascade of interacting problems, each feeding the others, each worsening over time. Closed ecosystems that cannot remain stable across centuries. Populations too small to sustain genetic health without reproductive controls that constrain individual freedom. Machines that cannot operate for hundreds of years without parts and expertise that may not survive the journey. Social structures that have no precedent for enduring confinement at this scale and duration. Communication with Earth that degrades from dialogue to monologue to silence. Each of these challenges is individually severe. Together, they form a compounding barrier that no increase in ship size, no advance in recycling efficiency, and no improvement in crew selection can fully overcome, because each attempted solution adds mass, complexity, cost, or social strain that amplifies the remaining problems. The generation ship does not solve the interstellar travel problem. It converts it. Instead of a physics and propulsion problem, it becomes a biology problem, a mechanical endurance problem, a genetics problem, a sociology problem, and a psychology problem, all stacked on top of one another inside a sealed metal world drifting through the emptiest space in the known universe. The mission does not merely need to cross the distance. It needs to keep a miniature civilization alive, functional, and motivated for longer than any civilization has ever continuously persisted on Earth. And it must do this while hurtling through a void where the penalty for a single critical failure is the extinction of everyone aboard. Time is not neutral. Time is the enemy. And on a generation ship, time has centuries to find the one weakness that ends everything. But perhaps the answer is not to go slowly at all. Perhaps the answer is to go fast, to compress the journey from centuries into decades, to send a single crew that departs and arrives within a single human lifetime. The generation ship surrenders to time and is destroyed by it. What if future technology could refuse to pay that price? What if the crossing could be made in 40 years, or 50, or 80? What if speed could outrun the decay? What comes next is the question of what happens when a spacecraft carrying human beings attempts to cross interstellar space at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The answer will not be what anyone hopes to hear. If time destroys the slow mission, the obvious response is speed. Compress the crossing from centuries into decades. Send a crew that departs Earth and arrives at another star within a single human lifetime. Eliminate the need for generation ships, closed ecosystems, and breeding populations entirely. Solve the problem not through endurance but through brevity. This instinct drives nearly every ambitious interstellar propulsion concept ever proposed. Nuclear pulse engines, fusion rockets, antimatter drives, laser-propelled sails. Each one promises to push a spacecraft fast enough that the journey becomes survivable through speed alone. Reach 10% of the speed of light, and Proxima Centauri drops to roughly 42 years away. Reach 20%, and the crossing compresses to approximately 21 years. At 50%, it shrinks to under 9 years. Speed appears to be the solution. For tiny robotic probes weighing less than a gram, it may genuinely be one. For a crude spacecraft carrying human beings, speed is not the solution. Speed is the second jaw of the trap, and it closes with a violence that the slow trap never approaches. The first barrier is energy, not the abstract notion that interstellar travel requires a lot of energy. The specific, calculable, physically immovable reality of how much energy it costs to accelerate a macroscopic object to a significant fraction of the speed of light. Begin with the most basic version of the problem. Take a modest payload of 100 metric tons, roughly the mass of a large airliner. This is absurdly small for a crude interstellar vessel, which would need to carry life support, radiation shielding, food production systems, crew quarters, and propulsion hardware massing thousands or tens of thousands of tons. But start with 100 tons just to see where the numbers lead. Accelerating 100 metric tons to 10% of the speed of light, approximately 30,000 kilometers per second, requires roughly 4.5 times 10 to the 19th joules of kinetic energy. That figure means nothing in the abstract. So here is what it means concretely. Humanity's total global electricity generation is approximately 30,000 terawatt-hours per year, which converts to roughly 10 to the 20th joules. The energy needed to push 100 tons to 10% of light speed equals nearly half of all the electricity the entire human civilization produces in an entire year. Every power plant on Earth, every solar panel, every wind turbine, every nuclear reactor, every hydroelectric dam, running flat out for 6 months, would barely generate enough energy to accelerate a single modest payload to a speed that still requires over 40 years to reach the nearest star. Now watch what happens as speed increases. Energy does not rise in proportion to speed. It rises with the square of velocity at low speeds, and far more steeply as relativistic effects accumulate. Double the speed from 10% to 20% of light speed. The kinetic energy does not double. It roughly quadruples, climbing to approximately 1.9 times 10 to the 20th joules. That is nearly twice the total annual electricity output of every nation on Earth combined, for 100 tons. At a speed that still requires over 20 years to reach the nearest star, pushed to 50% of the speed of light, the kinetic energy climbs to approximately 1.4 times 10 to the 21st joules. That is roughly 14 times the annual electrical output of the entire planet. Still for 100 tons. Still for a payload far too small to carry a human crew with any realistic life support infrastructure. A crewed interstellar vessel with radiation shielding, structural mass, food production systems, water recycling, atmospheric processing, crew habitation, propulsion hardware, and fuel would mass not 100 tons but thousands or tens of thousands of tons at minimum. For 10,000 metric tons, the energy required at 10% of light speed rises to approximately 4.5 times 10 to the 21st joules. That is more than 40 times the annual electricity production of the entire human species. At 20% of light speed, the figure exceeds 170 times global annual electricity. These are staggering numbers, and they represent only the acceleration phase. A crewed mission does not merely need to reach the target star, it needs to stop there. A ship that arrives at Proxima Centauri at 10% of the speed of light, roughly 30,000 kilometers per second, will flash through the entire star system in a matter of hours. It cannot enter orbit. It cannot land. It cannot explore. It flies past and continues into the void forever, carrying its crew with it. To actually arrive, the ship must decelerate, which requires expending roughly the same amount of energy again. The total energy budget for a crewed round trip, accounting for acceleration, cruising, deceleration at the destination, and the return journey, is roughly 4 times the one-way acceleration cost. For a 10,000-ton vessel at 10% of light speed, this means the total mission energy approaches 200 times the annual electrical output of human civilization for a single mission to the nearest star, and these calculations account only for the kinetic energy of the payload. They do not include the energy wasted as heat, the energy lost to imperfect propulsion efficiency, or the energy needed to power onboard systems during the crossing. Real engineering margins would push the total higher still. The numbers are not negotiable. They are not estimates that better engineering can revise downward. They emerge directly from the relationship between mass, velocity, and energy described by the laws of physics. No technology can change that relationship. A more efficient engine can convert fuel into thrust more effectively, but it cannot reduce the kinetic energy of the final payload. The energy must come from somewhere. It must be stored, carried, or beamed to the spacecraft, and the amounts required are so large that they dwarf the energy infrastructure of the civilization attempting the launch. This leads directly into the second barrier, which amplifies the first beyond recognition. It is called the rocket equation, and it is the single most merciless constraint in all of spaceflight engineering. Any spacecraft that carries its own fuel faces a brutal mathematical reality. The fuel has mass. That mass must also be accelerated, which requires more fuel, which has more mass, which requires still more fuel. The relationship is exponential. As the desired velocity increases, the ratio of fuel mass to payload mass does not grow linearly. It grows as a power of the mathematical constant E, roughly 2.718. For modest velocities, this is manageable. Chemical rockets routinely achieve orbit with fuel-to-payload ratios in the single digits. But for interstellar velocities, the exponential becomes catastrophic. Consider fusion propulsion, currently the most energetically plausible concept for interstellar travel that does not rely on external power sources. A well-designed fusion rocket might achieve an effective exhaust velocity of approximately 10,000 kilometers per second. To accelerate a payload to 10% of the speed of light, 30,000 kilometers per second, the rocket equation demands a fuel-to-payload mass ratio of approximately 20:1. That means for every ton of payload, you need 20 tons of fusion fuel loaded at departure. Challenging, but perhaps not impossible for an unmanned probe. Now push the target velocity to 20% of light speed. The mass ratio leaps to roughly 400:1. For every ton of useful payload, 400 tons of fuel. A 10,000-ton crewed vessel would require 4 million tons of fuel. The ship becomes almost entirely fuel, with the crew and their habitat reduced to a tiny fraction of the total mass. A passenger compartment strapped to an ocean of thermonuclear propellant. At 50% of the speed of light, the mass ratio for a fusion rocket exceeds 3 million:1. The numbers cease to have engineering meaning. No conceivable structure can support a fuel load that outweighs its payload by a factor of 3 million. The fuel alone would mass more than most asteroids. You are no longer designing a spacecraft. You are designing a small celestial body that happens to have an engine. Antimatter propulsion offers the highest theoretical exhaust velocity of any known fuel, because matter-antimatter annihilation converts nearly all of the fuel's rest mass into energy. But antimatter introduces its own impossibility. Current global production of antimatter amounts to nanograms per year, generated in particle accelerators at costs that can only be described as astronomical. Producing a single gram of antimatter with existing technology would require more energy than the entire world consumes in a year, and would cost on the order of tens of trillions of dollars. A crewed interstellar mission using antimatter propulsion would need tons of the material. Producing that quantity would require scaling antimatter manufacturing by a factor of roughly a quadrillion beyond current capability, a gap so vast it makes fusion propulsion look like a solved problem by comparison. Every propulsion concept that carries its own fuel hits the same wall. The fuel to carry the fuel to carry the fuel compounds exponentially, and the energy available from any known fuel source runs into the ceiling imposed by the mass-energy relationship long before the spacecraft reaches a velocity that makes interstellar crossing times tolerable for human crews. The rocket equation does not care how clever the engineering is. It is a mathematical identity. It cannot be bypassed, only obeyed. Suppose, despite everything, a spacecraft carrying human beings could be accelerated to 10 or 20% of the speed of light. The energy problem would be behind it. The fuel would be spent. The ship would be cruising. The crossing would be measured in decades rather than centuries. What remains to threaten the mission? The answer is the space between the stars. And at high velocity, that space fights back with a ferocity that no one standing safely on Earth can easily imagine. The interstellar medium is not empty. It contains approximately 1 hydrogen atom per cubic centimeter on average, along with trace amounts of helium, heavier elements, and solid dust particles ranging in size from individual molecules to grains, a fraction of a millimeter across. At low velocities, this material is completely irrelevant. Voyager One has been drifting through it for over a decade with no measurable damage. The particles are too sparse and the velocity too low to produce any meaningful impact. But at a significant fraction of the speed of light, the relationship between spacecraft and interstellar gas transforms utterly. What was empty space becomes a storm. What was harmless gas becomes a weapon. The medium does not move. The ship moves through it. And the faster the ship travels, the harder the medium strikes. The specific physics of what happens at each velocity threshold reveals how severe this bombardment becomes. At 10% of the speed of light, Every hydrogen atom that strikes the forward surface of the spacecraft carries kinetic energy in the range of several mega-electron volts. That is the energy scale of nuclear radiation. Each atom acts like a particle fired from a nuclear accelerator, slamming into the hull at relativistic speed and depositing its energy in the outermost layers of material. The impact does not merely dent the surface, it penetrates, creating microscopic damage tracks in crystalline structures, displacing atoms from their lattice positions, and generating bursts of secondary radiation as the incoming particle decelerates inside the hull. One atom is nothing, 1,000 atoms per second are nothing. But a spacecraft with a forward cross-section of even 100 square meters, traveling at 10% of the speed of light through gas at half an atom per cubic centimeter, intercepts roughly 1.5 quadrillion hydrogen atoms every single second. Each one delivers mega-electron volt energy. The cumulative effect over years of transit is a relentless, unceasing irradiation of the entire forward structure of the vessel. Research published in the Astrophysical Journal has quantified the surface damage. At 20% of the speed of light, hydrogen and heavier interstellar atoms produce radiation damage, tracks in quartz and similar materials to a depth of approximately 1/10 of a millimeter after traversing the gas column between here and Alpha Centauri. That sounds shallow, but it represents wholesale restructuring of the surface material at the atomic level. Sensitive instruments, optical surfaces, thermal coatings, and communication equipment on the leading face of the spacecraft would degrade continuously for the entire duration of the crossing. Dust makes the situation dramatically worse. Interstellar dust grains are tiny, typically a fraction of a micrometer in diameter, but they are not negligible at relativistic speeds. A single grain 1/10 of a millimeter across, too small for the human eye to detect, carries a mass of roughly 1/1000th of a kilogram. At 10% of the speed of light, the kinetic energy of that grain is approximately 450,000 joules. That is comparable to the energy released by a military hand grenade. One invisible speck of interstellar dust, striking the hull of a spacecraft at 30,000 kilometers per second, delivers an explosion equivalent to a grenade detonating against the outer skin. At 20% of the speed of light, the same grain carries approximately 1.8 million joules. At 50%, it exceeds 11 million joules, rivaling the energy of several kilograms of TNT, and these are sub-millimeter grains. Larger particles, while rarer, carry proportionally more devastating energy. The interstellar medium is not a void, it is a shooting gallery, and the faster you travel through it, the harder every projectile hits. The cumulative effect of dust bombardment at relativistic speeds is surface erosion. Each impact vaporizes a small crater in the hull material, ejecting atoms and creating localized melting. Over the course of a multi-decade crossing, the leading face of the spacecraft is subjected to thousands or millions of such impacts, each one gouging away a tiny piece of the ship. Studies estimate that at 20% of light speed, dust erosion can remove approximately 0.5 millimeter of surface material over the distance to Alpha Centauri. For a heavily shielded hull, this may be survivable. For exposed instruments, sensors, communication arrays, or viewport windows, it is progressively destructive. The ship arrives with its forward face sandblasted smooth by a storm of relativistic grit that lasted decades. Shielding against this bombardment is theoretically possible but practically crippling. A physical shield thick enough to absorb decades of relativistic dust impacts without compromising the hull must be massive. Adding a shield several centimeters thick across the entire forward cross-section of a large crewed vessel adds hundreds or thousands of tons of inert mass. That mass must be accelerated along with everything else, which increases the fuel requirement, which increases the total mass, which demands more fuel. The shielding problem feeds directly back into the energy problem and the rocket equation. Every kilogram of protection requires kilograms of additional fuel to accelerate, which requires its own protection, which requires its own fuel. The cycle compounds until the engineering becomes unworkable. Magnetic deflection has been proposed as an alternative. A powerful magnetic field projected ahead of the spacecraft could theoretically deflect charged particles away from the hull. But interstellar dust grains are electrically neutral. They carry no charge and are unaffected by magnetic fields. And even charged hydrogen atoms are deflected only if the magnetic field is extraordinarily strong, requiring superconducting magnets of enormous size and power consumption. The magnetic shielding concept solves part of the gas problem, while doing nothing about the dust problem and introducing its own mass and power penalties. Layered on top of the interstellar medium bombardment is the ambient radiation environment of deep space. Galactic cosmic rays, high-energy protons, and heavier nuclei, accelerated to nearly the speed of light by distant supernova explosions, permeate interstellar space in all directions. These particles carry energies ranging from hundreds of mega-electron volts to billions of giga-electron volts. They cannot be stopped by conventional shielding materials. High-energy cosmic ray particles pass through meters of aluminum, steel, or polyethylene, and as they do, they shatter the nuclei of atoms in the shielding itself, producing cascades of secondary radiation that can be more biologically damaging than the original particle. Adding more shielding material does not always reduce the dose. Above a certain thickness, it can actually increase it by generating more secondary particles. NASA estimates the unshielded galactic cosmic ray dose rate in deep interstellar space at approximately 0.45 milligray per day. Over a 42-year crossing to Proxima Centauri at 10% of the speed of light, the cumulative dose exceeds 6.5 gray, not counting the additional radiation generated by the interstellar medium bombardment already described, which adds substantially to the total exposure. For perspective, a whole-body dose of roughly 5 gray delivered over a short period is lethal to most humans. The interstellar dose is accumulated over decades rather than minutes, which reduces acute lethality, but chronic exposure to galactic cosmic rays at this level is associated with dramatically elevated cancer risk, cardiovascular damage, cataracts, and central nervous system impairment, including measurable cognitive decline. Studies using simulated galactic cosmic ray fields at facilities like the NASA Space Radiation Laboratory have shown persistent changes in brain tissue structure, DNA methylation patterns linked to lung cancer, immune system degradation, and accelerated onset of Alzheimer-like symptoms in animal models. The crew of a fast interstellar vessel would not merely be travelling, they would be marinating in nuclear radiation for decades, with biological consequences that no medical countermeasure currently in development can fully prevent. For the crew aboard such a vessel, the experience would not resemble any form of travel that human beings have ever known. It would resemble a slow, irreversible poisoning. In the first years of the crossing, the effects might be subtle, slightly elevated fatigue, occasional headaches, a vague sense that concentration requires more effort than it once did. By the midpoint of a 40-year voyage, cumulative radiation damage would begin producing measurable outcomes. Vision would cloud as cataracts formed, cancer rates would climb, cardiovascular tissue would stiffen and degrade. The crew's own medical officers, if they survived, would chart the declining health of everyone aboard using instruments that could quantify the damage but not reverse it. Every crew member would understand, with the precision of a dosimeter reading, that their body was being progressively dismantled by particles they could not see, could not feel, and could not escape. The ship would still be years from its destination, with no option to turn back and no port where the crew could step outside and recover. The radiation is not a malfunction, it is the environment. A crewed interstellar vessel must somehow protect its occupants from this radiation for the entire duration of the crossing. The most effective known shielding against galactic cosmic rays is mass. specifically hydrogen-rich materials like water or polyethylene, deployed in layers several meters thick around the crew habitat. The mass penalty is staggering. Enclosing a crew habitat in a water shield 2 meters thick on all sides adds thousands of tons to the vessel's mass. Once again, this mass must be accelerated, which demands more fuel, which adds more mass. The radiation shielding problem does not exist in isolation. It feeds directly into the energy and mass cascade that already makes crude relativistic travel nearly impossible. Navigation at relativistic speed introduces yet another constraint absent from conventional spaceflight. At 10% of the speed of light, the spacecraft covers roughly 30,000 kilometers every second. A course error of a fraction of a degree, compounded across trillions of kilometers, can result in the ship missing its target star system by billions of kilometers. The ship cannot stop to recalculate. It cannot request updated coordinates from Earth and receive a useful reply, because any message takes years to traverse the growing gulf between ship and homeworld. Navigation must be performed autonomously, using onboard instruments that must maintain calibration across decades of continuous operation in a radiation-saturated, dust-eroded environment. The same forces that degrade the hull and the crew also degrade the instruments responsible for ensuring the ship arrives where it intends to. A navigation failure does not merely delay the mission. It sends a vessel carrying the last hopes of its crew into empty interstellar space, with no possibility of correction and no destination at the end of the drift. The most promising proposed solution for reaching another star at high speed avoids most of these problems by abandoning the idea of carrying fuel entirely. Breakthrough Starshot, a research initiative announced in 2016, and originally backed by the late physicist Stephen Hawking and investor Yuri Milner, proposed using an enormous ground-based laser array to accelerate a tiny reflective sail attached to a gram-scale microchip probe. 100 gigawatts of focused laser light would push the sail to approximately 20% of the speed of light within minutes of illumination. The probe would cross the 4.24 light-years to Alpha Centauri in roughly 20 years, fly through the star system, collect data during the brief encounter, and transmit its findings back to Earth using an onboard laser. The concept is physically sound. Research teams at Caltech, Delft University of Technology, and other institutions have fabricated prototype light sail materials, including pentagonal photonic crystal reflectors, reported in Nature Communications in 2025, that achieved a 9,000-fold reduction in fabrication cost per square meter. Laboratory measurements have confirmed direct radiation pressure acceleration on tethered miniature sails. The physics works. For a gram-scale probe, laser propulsion to relativistic speed is not fantasy. It is the subject of active, funded, peer-reviewed engineering research. But the gap between a gram-scale flyby probe and a crewed interstellar vessel is not one that scaling can bridge. It is a gap between fundamentally incompatible classes of engineering. The probe weighs 1 gram. A crewed ship weighs millions of kilograms at minimum. The laser power required to accelerate a sail scales with the mass being pushed. Scaling breakthrough. Starshot's 100 gigawatts to a 1,000 kilogram payload, still far too small for a crewed vessel, would require roughly 100,000 trillion watts of laser power focused on a sail hundreds of meters across. That exceeds the total power output of human civilization by a factor of several thousand. For a 10,000-ton vessel, the numbers leave the realm of engineering and enter the realm of absurdity. The probe also cannot decelerate. It flies through the target system at 20% of the speed of light, gathering data for a few hours during the encounter before hurtling onward into the void forever. A crewed mission must slow down. It must enter orbit or at least reduce its velocity enough for meaningful exploration. Deceleration requires either carrying fuel, which destroys the mass advantage of external propulsion, or deploying a braking mechanism at the destination, which does not exist. Breakthrough Starshot solves the problem of reaching a star. It does not solve the problem of arriving at one. The probe carries no life support, no food, no water, no radiation shielding, no crew quarters. It is a chip. It succeeds precisely because it is not a human mission. Every constraint that makes crude interstellar travel so punishing, the mass of shielding, the volume of consumables, the fragility of biological passengers, simply does not apply to a device smaller than a postage stamp. The technology that may one day send humanity's instruments to another star is by its very nature incapable of sending humanity itself. This is the architecture of the fast trap. Every attempt to compress the journey into a human lifetime crashes into the same cascading sequence of physical constraints. Faster speeds demand exponentially more energy. More energy demands more fuel, which adds mass, which demands still more energy. Higher velocities transform the interstellar medium from a negligible background into a lethal bombardment of relativistic gas and dust. Shielding against that bombardment adds mass, which feeds back into the energy spiral. Radiation from galactic cosmic rays penetrates every known shielding material, and adding more shielding generates secondary radiation that can worsen the dose. Every proposed solution addresses one component of the problem while amplifying others. Nuclear propulsion improves exhaust velocity, but cannot reach relativistic speeds without mass ratios that exceed any practical structure. Fusion propulsion pushes the boundary further but still hits the exponential wall above 20% of light speed. Antimatter offers the highest energy density of any known substance, but cannot be produced in quantities larger than nanograms per year. Laser sails bypass the fuel problem, but cannot carry human passengers or decelerate at the destination. Each concept solves a piece of the puzzle while leaving the rest unsolved, and the unsolved pieces are not minor engineering details. They are fundamental physical barriers. Nuclear pulse propulsion. The concept explored under the name Project Orion in the late 1950s and early 1960s proposed detonating small nuclear devices behind a massive pusher plate to generate thrust. The concept was physically credible. Calculations showed that a sufficiently large Orion vehicle could theoretically reach 3 to 5% of the speed of light, but the practical requirements were staggering. The vehicle would need to carry and detonate thousands of nuclear devices. The pusher plate would need to survive repeated nuclear blasts at close range. The crew would need to endure the violent acceleration pulses and the residual radiation from each detonation. Atmospheric nuclear testban treaties halted the project before any flight hardware was built. Even in its most optimistic configurations, Orion could not push a crewed vessel beyond a few percent of light speed, a velocity at which the crossing to Proxima Centauri still requires well over a century. Fusion propulsion represents the next step, offering significantly higher exhaust velocities, but no self-sustaining fusion reactor has ever been built on Earth for power generation, let alone integrated into a spacecraft propulsion system. The engineering challenge of confining a plasma at hundreds of millions of degrees inside a vessel that must also function as an interstellar transport remains unsolved after more than 70 years of research. Even if fusion propulsion is eventually mastered, the rocket equation imposes its exponential penalty above 20% of light speed, ensuring that the fuel mass overwhelms any practical spacecraft structure. The fast trap is not a mirror image of the slow trap. It is worse. The slow trap kills gradually, through accumulating failures over centuries. The fast trap kills through brute physics, through energies too large to generate, through impacts too violent to shield against, through radiation too penetrating to block. Both traps close on the same target, a crewed spacecraft attempting to cross the distance between two stars, and between them, they leave almost no viable corridor. What remains is the hardest question of all. What does interstellar travel actually look like when every optimistic assumption is stripped away? What is genuinely possible? What is genuinely plausible? And what may remain permanently beyond reach? The answer requires confronting not just the physics of distance and speed, but the deeper question of what it means to be a biological species attempting to cross a universe that was never designed with passengers in mind. Both jaws of the trap are now visible. The slow jaw, in which time disassembles the mission through ecosystem failure, genetic erosion, mechanical decay, and the slow collapse of social order inside a sealed vessel. The fast jaw, in which energy costs escalate exponentially. The interstellar medium becomes a weapon, radiation saturates every shielding design, and the rocket equation devours any spacecraft that tries to carry its own fuel to relativistic speed. Two jaws, two directions, and between them, no safe corridor. Every realistic velocity for a crewed interstellar vessel falls somewhere inside the overlapping kill zone of both problems. Travel at 1% of the speed of light, and the crossing takes over 4 centuries. The ship inherits the full weight of the slow trap: closed ecosystems, generational survival, mechanical endurance across timescales that dwarf every engineering precedent, social continuity in permanent confinement. Travel at 10% of light speed, and the crossing drops to about 42 years, survivable within a single human lifetime. But the fast trap takes over. The energy required to accelerate even a modest crewed vessel exceeds the total annual electricity output of human civilization many times over, and the ship spends decades being hammered by relativistic gas and dust, while the crew absorbs galactic cosmic radiation that no practical shielding can fully block. Pushed to 20%, and the energy cost becomes hundreds of times greater than global electricity output, while the interstellar medium bombardment intensifies to the point of measurable structural erosion. Attempt a compromise somewhere in between, say 3 to 5% of the speed of light. The crossing time falls to roughly 85 to 140 years, long enough to require at least 2 or 3 generations aboard, bringing back a significant portion of the slow trap's biological and social burdens, but short enough that the energy requirements, while enormous, are less catastrophic than at 10% of light speed. The interstellar medium bombardment is less violent but still present, accumulating damage over decades. Cosmic radiation exposure remains dangerous across a crossing of this length. The mechanical endurance challenge remains severe, though not as extreme as for a multi-century generation ship. This middle ground does not resolve the problem. It merely inherits a moderate version of every constraint from both traps simultaneously rather than the extreme version of one. It is a corridor, but it is not a safe one. There is no speed at which both problems simultaneously become manageable for a vessel carrying human beings. This is not a temporary engineering gap that future breakthroughs will close. It is a structural feature of the interstellar travel problem itself, built into the fundamental relationships between distance, velocity, energy, and the biological requirements of human survival. Understanding why this feature may be permanent requires examining how the constraints interact with each other, and why every proposed solution for one of them inevitably amplifies at least one of the others. The problems do not stack like bricks, each resting independently on the one below. They interlock. Radiation shielding adds mass. Mass increases the energy needed for acceleration. More energy demands more fuel, which adds more mass, which requires more shielding, which adds more mass again. The spiral feeds on itself. Closed-loop life support systems require mechanical complexity. Pumps, filters, bioreactors, atmospheric processors, water purifiers, nutrient recyclers. Each component is a potential point of failure. Adding redundancy to guard against failure increases the total number of components, each of which is itself a potential point of failure. The redundancy that protects against one breakdown simultaneously increases the probability that some other component will break. Crew size affects genetic viability, which demands larger populations, which demand more food production, which demands more agricultural space, which demands more atmospheric volume, which demands more structural mass. which drives the energy cost higher and the shielding requirements deeper. Every fix feeds another problem. Every solution is also a cost. The system does not simplify as technology improves. It merely shifts the bottleneck from one constraint to the next, and the next constraint is always waiting. This cascading structure is what separates interstellar travel from every previous challenge in the history of spaceflight. Getting to the moon required solving a propulsion problem. Getting to Mars requires solving a life support and duration problem. Getting to the outer planets requires solving a power and communication problem. Each of these challenges has a dominant constraint, and conquering that constraint largely resolves the mission. Interstellar travel has no dominant constraint. It has a web of constraints, and pulling on any single thread tightens the others. Several partial solutions have been proposed that attempt to cut through this web. Each deserves examination, not because any one of them solves the problem, but because understanding why each one fails to solve it reveals the true depth of the barrier. Suspended animation, sometimes called human torpor, is the idea that crew members could be placed into a state of dramatically reduced metabolism for the duration of the crossing. Their bodies would cool. Their hearts would slow. Their oxygen consumption would drop to a fraction of normal. The ship could be smaller, carry less food, and require less atmospheric processing. The psychological burden of confinement would vanish because the crew would be unconscious. Research into synthetic torpor is real and actively funded. The European Space Agency has supported investigations into inducing hibernation-like states in humans, and researchers believe that reducing metabolic rate by 20 to 70% may become medically feasible within the next decade or two, at least for short periods. But the gap between a medically induced metabolic reduction lasting days or weeks and a torpor state lasting decades or centuries is not a gap that incremental progress will bridge in any foreseeable time frame. No mammal on Earth hibernates for more than approximately 7 months. No human has ever been maintained in a torpor state for more than a few days under clinical supervision. Extending that duration to years would require understanding and controlling biological processes at a level of precision that medicine is nowhere near achieving. Extending it to decades introduces entirely unknown risks: cumulative cellular damage, brain degradation, muscle and bone deterioration, organ failure from prolonged inactivity. And even if perfect torpor were achievable, the ship still needs to function. The life support system still needs to operate. The hull still needs to resist radiation and dust erosion. The power source still needs to run. The navigation system still needs to track the ship's course across trillions of kilometers. Putting the crew to sleep reduces the biological support burden, but it does not eliminate the mechanical endurance problem, the shielding problem, or the energy problem. It is a partial fix applied to one component of a system that fails across many components simultaneously. Relativistic time dilation offers another apparent escape route. Einstein's special relativity predicts that time passes more slowly for objects moving at very high velocities relative to a stationary observer. At 87% of the speed of light, time aboard the ship would pass at roughly half the rate experienced on Earth. A journey that takes 50 years in the Earth frame would feel like 25 years to the crew. At 99% of light speed, the time dilation factor reaches approximately 7, meaning a 50-year Earth frame crossing would feel like only about 7 years aboard the vessel. At 99.9%, the factor climbs higher still, compressing decades of travel into months of subjective experience. This sounds transformative. It suggests that if a spacecraft could reach sufficiently high velocity, the crew could arrive at a distant star, having aged only a few years. The interstellar crossing would feel like a long plane flight rather than a life sentence. The biological burden of the journey would shrink to almost nothing. But it is a mirage. The speeds required to produce meaningful time dilation lie far deeper into the fast trap than anything discussed so far. Reaching 87% of light speed demands roughly 7 times the energy of reaching 50%, which itself already requires 14 times the annual electricity output of the entire planet for a modest 100-ton payload. At 99%, the energy requirement escalates by yet another order of magnitude, pushing into territory where the fuel mass exceeds any conceivable spacecraft structure by factors of thousands or millions. The relativistic kinetic energy curve does not rise gently toward light speed. It rises vertically, approaching infinity as the velocity approaches the speed of light. Time dilation is real physics. But accessing it requires velocities so extreme that the energy, radiation, and impact problems become not merely severe but categorically unsolvable with any known or foreseeable technology. You cannot use time dilation to soften the fast trap because you can only reach the dilation regime by plunging deeper into the fast trap than any prior analysis even considered. And time dilation carries a hidden cruelty that has no technological remedy. The crew ages slowly, but Earth does not. A crew that experiences 7 years of subjective time, while 50 years pass on Earth returns, if they return at all, to a world that has aged half a century without them. Their families are dead or elderly. The culture they grew up in has shifted beyond recognition. The scientific knowledge they carried at departure is now outdated by decades. Their professional skills may be obsolete. The language itself may have drifted. They are not heroes returning from a grand voyage. They are temporal refugees, stranded in a future they helped create, but can never fully belong to. The faster the ship travels, the wider this temporal rift becomes. At extreme relativistic speeds, the crew could return to find that centuries or millennia have elapsed on Earth, that the civilization that launched them has transformed into something unrecognizable or vanished entirely. Time dilation does not eliminate the cost of interstellar travel. It transfers that cost from the crew's bodies to their bonds with every person and every institution they left behind. The crossing preserves their cells but destroys their world. Faster-than-light concepts, including warp drives and traversable wormholes, surface inevitably in any discussion of interstellar travel. The Alcubierre metric, proposed in 1994, describes a theoretical space-time geometry in which a bubble of warped space could carry a spacecraft at effective speeds exceeding light without violating the local speed limit within the bubble itself. Traversable wormholes, if they exist, would connect distant points in spacetime through a topological shortcut permitting instantaneous or near-instantaneous passage across distances that light requires years to span. These ideas are mathematically coherent within the framework of general relativity. They are not physically achievable by any means known to current science, nor by any means that current physics can identify a pathway toward. Both concepts require forms of matter or energy that have never been observed in nature, generated in a laboratory or detected by any instrument ever built. The Alcubierre drive requires negative energy density in enormous quantities, a condition that quantum field theory permits under extremely restricted circumstances, but that no experiment has ever produced at macroscopic scale. Traversable wormholes require exotic matter with negative mass energy to hold the throat open, and no physical substance with these properties has ever been identified. Subsequent theoretical analyses have revealed additional barriers, potential instabilities that would collapse the warp bubble or wormhole before anything could transit, energy requirements that may exceed the mass energy of entire stars, and the probable formation of event horizons that would destroy any payload attempting passage. These are not engineering challenges awaiting future solutions. They are fundamental theoretical obstacles rooted in the deepest structures of general relativity and quantum mechanics. Treating warp drives and wormholes as future technologies waiting to be developed is not optimism. It is speculation unsupported by any experimental evidence, dressed in the language of equations. With every proposed shortcut examined and found wanting, the question narrows to a stark one. What is actually possible? The honest answer requires abandoning the habit of discussing interstellar travel as though it were a single, unified problem. It is not. It is at least 5 distinct problems, and the feasibility of each differs so dramatically that lumping them together produces only confusion. The first and most achievable category is the gram-scale robotic flyby. Sending a tiny probe, massing roughly 1 gram, on a one-way dash through a nearby star system is physically plausible with technology that is either available today or under active development. Breakthrough starshot and related directed energy concepts have demonstrated in laboratory settings that laser pressure can accelerate reflective membranes, and that materials capable of surviving the acceleration exist. If the engineering challenges of constructing and operating a 100-gigawatt laser array can be overcome, and if the probe survives the interstellar crossing, it could reach Alpha Centauri within approximately 20 years and begin transmitting data back to Earth via a tiny onboard laser. The return signal would take another 4 years to arrive. Within a single human lifetime, humanity could receive direct observational data from a neighboring star system. This is not fantasy. It is the subject of peer-reviewed research at major universities and funded by established scientific organizations. It may happen within this century. It would represent one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of science. The second category is the larger robotic probe with deceleration capability. A spacecraft weighing tens or hundreds of kilograms, carrying more sophisticated instruments with the ability to slow down at the target star, enter orbit, and conduct sustained observations over months or years. This requires propulsion systems that do not yet exist, most likely some form of fusion drive or advanced ion propulsion, and the engineering challenges are substantially greater than for a gram-scale flyby. Deceleration at the target star either invokes the full weight of the rocket equation or relies on speculative braking technologies such as magnetic sails interacting with the stellar wind. This category is not achievable in the near term, but it is not physically impossible. It may become feasible within a century or two if fusion propulsion matures, though this is speculative rather than assured. The third category is the crewed one-way mission, a vessel carrying living human beings across interstellar space, with life support, radiation shielding, and enough infrastructure to keep the crew alive for the duration of the crossing. This is where every problem documented in this story converges. Energy, mass, fuel, radiation, dust, ecosystems, mechanical endurance, social structure, genetic viability, communication delay, and permanent separation from Earth. No single technology resolves more than one or two of these constraints simultaneously, and addressing any constraint typically worsens at least one other. A crewed one-way mission to the nearest star is not prohibited by the laws of physics in the way that perpetual motion or faster-than-light signaling is prohibited, but it may be effectively prohibited by the compounding interaction of every engineering, biological, and social constraint that applies to keeping fragile biological organisms alive and functioning inside a sealed machine for decades or centuries in the most hostile environment accessible to human experience. The distinction between physically forbidden and practically unachievable matters enormously for scientific honesty. It changes nothing for the crew. The fourth category is the crewed round trip, and the fifth is the repeatable interstellar transportation network. Each successive category multiplies every constraint by additional factors. A round trip doubles the energy, the duration, and the radiation exposure. A transportation network requires solving every constraint at industrial scale and sustaining that solution economically across indefinite time. These categories recede so far beyond foreseeable capability that they belong in the domain of speculative fiction rather than engineering analysis. The word impossible requires careful handling. It is perhaps the most dangerous word in science communication because it is almost always heard as absolute when it is almost never meant that way. Interstellar travel is not impossible the way perpetual motion machines are impossible, violating fundamental conservation laws that no technology, no matter how advanced, can circumvent. It is not impossible the way exceeding the speed of light within special relativity is impossible, running against a hard mathematical ceiling that more energy only reinforces rather than overcomes. Those are absolute impossibilities. They are built into the architecture of physics itself. Interstellar travel is impossible in a different and more subtle sense. It is the kind of impossibility where every individual barrier might, in principle, be reduced by future technology. But the combined height of all the barriers acting together, each one feeding the others, exceeds the practical reach of any civilization whose members are made of cells that require oxygen, water, warmth, and gravity to function. Future technology will almost certainly improve propulsion efficiency. It will improve radiation shielding. It will improve life support reliability. It may even master synthetic torpor well enough to put human crews to sleep for years at a time. But improving each component does not eliminate the system-level problem, because the system-level problem is not the weakness of any one component. It is the interaction between all of them, sustained across distances and durations that provide no forgiveness for error. A future civilization might develop fusion propulsion capable of reaching 5 or even 10% of the speed of light. It might master synthetic torpor well enough to keep a small crew unconscious for decades. It might build radiation shielding far superior to anything available today. It might engineer closed ecological systems that vastly outperform anything current science has attempted. Each of these advances is conceivable. Some may even be likely, given sufficient time and investment. None of them is guaranteed. And even if every single one of them were achieved simultaneously, which would represent a convergence of breakthroughs unprecedented in the history of technology, the combined system would still face an 85-year crossing to the nearest star at 5% of light speed. Decades of cumulative cosmic radiation exposure that no shielding fully eliminates, continuous dust erosion of the forward hull, mechanical systems operating beyond any tested endurance envelope, and total, irrevocable isolation from Earth and every support structure human civilization has ever built. Every problem is reduced. None is removed. The wall is lower, but it is still a wall. And behind it, the stars remain exactly where they have always been. This is the realization that changes everything. The barrier to interstellar travel is not a single missing technology. It is not one breakthrough away from falling. It is the cumulative weight of every constraint acting together, reinforcing each other, forming a structure that does not have a single point of failure because it does not have a single point at all. It is a wall without a gate. You cannot walk around it because it extends in every direction. You cannot dig under it because its foundations are the laws of physics. You cannot climb over it because every handhold you find shifts the problem rather than resolving it. The universe did not build this wall out of malice. It built it out of scale. The distances between stars are so large, the speeds required so extreme, the energies so vast, and the durations so long that biological life, bound to conditions so narrow and so specific that only a planet can reliably provide them, cannot be transported across them without a cost that may exceed what any civilization is able or willing to pay. Human beings are creatures of Earth. That statement sounds like a platitude. It is the most important fact in the entire interstellar travel debate. Every cell in the human body evolved under 1 atmosphere of pressure, at temperatures between roughly 0 and 45 degrees Celsius, shielded by a planetary magnetic field that deflects the worst cosmic radiation, nourished by a biosphere that has been recycling oxygen, water, carbon, and nitrogen at continental scale for longer than complex life has existed. These conditions are not optional. They are not luxuries that a sufficiently tough astronaut can do without. They are the baseline requirements for human cellular function. Remove any single one of them for long enough and the body begins to fail. Remove several and it fails quickly. The only way to provide them away from Earth is to build a machine that replicates them artificially, continuously, and flawlessly for the entire duration of the crossing. That machine is the mission, not the engine, not the fuel, not the navigation system. The sealed, self-sustaining, self-repairing artificial world that must carry biological beings through an environment that is hostile to them in every measurable dimension. Temperature, radiation, vacuum, microgravity, isolation, duration. The universe does not attack the crew. It simply offers them nothing. No air, no water, no warmth, no food, no shelter, no gravity, no magnetic protection, no rescue. The indifference of interstellar space is total and permanent. Earth's biosphere provides everything a human being needs without any conscious effort on the part of the human. It has been doing so for 4 billion years, across a planetary surface so vast and an atmosphere so massive that local disruptions are absorbed without global consequence. A starship must replicate the outputs of that biosphere inside a metal hull smaller than a city block, using systems that have never been tested at this duration, with no external input, no backup reservoir, and no tolerance for failure that lasts longer than the crew can survive without the failed system. The gap between what Earth provides and what a starship must provide is not a gap of technology. It is a gap of scale so extreme that it may define a permanent boundary around what biological civilizations can achieve. Future humans will look at the stars with instruments far more sensitive than anything that exists today. They will map the surfaces of exoplanets orbiting neighboring stars in spectral detail that current telescopes cannot approach. They will measure the chemical compositions of alien atmospheres and search for the telltale signatures of water vapor, free oxygen, methane, and the delicate chemical imbalances that only living systems produce. They may identify worlds that show unmistakable evidence of biological activity, worlds where something is alive, orbiting stars that are visible to the unaided eye on a clear and cloudless night. They will know those worlds exist. They will understand their climates, their geological histories, perhaps even the colours of their vegetation if vegetation is what grows there. And they will face a realization that no telescope can soften. Knowing that a living world exists and being able to set foot on it are separated by a gulf that no amount of knowledge, no depth of understanding, and no revolution in propulsion technology can fully close. The gulf is not made of ignorance. It is not a darkness waiting to be dispelled by a brighter lamp. It is made of distance, energy, time, and the irreducible requirements of biological survival far from the only world that evolution designed for us. The light from that distant living planet reaches Earth effortlessly, crossing the void at the universe's maximum speed. But a human being is not a photon. A human being needs air and water and food and warmth and gravity and medicine and companionship and hope, all sustained without interruption for decades or centuries, inside a vessel hurtling through an environment that provides none of these things and never will. The terrifying truth at the heart of interstellar travel is not that the stars are far away. Humanity has known that for centuries. The terrifying truth is that distance forces a choice between timescales that destroy biological missions and energies that overwhelm any conceivable propulsion system, while human survival demands warmth, pressure, breathable air, clean water, nourishment, radiation protection, medical care, mechanical reliability, social structure, and psychological continuity, all maintained without failure inside a vessel crossing a void that offers no shelter, no rescue, and no second attempt. Tiny probes may cross that void. Robotic emissaries may one day transmit images and measurements from the nearest star. That is a genuine, achievable, and magnificent aspiration, and it may be realized within the lifetime of people alive today. But human beings, warm and fragile and dependent on air and water and light and gravity and each other, may look at the stars with better engines, better materials, and deeper understanding than any generation before them, and still discover that the real wall was never technology at all. It was the cost of carrying Earth-born life across a universe that was never built for travelers between suns. The stars are there. They have always been there. They will burn for billions of years after the last human eye turns upward to search for them in the dark. What separates us from those distant furnaces is not a problem waiting to be solved. It is a condition to be understood, a silence written into the structure of the cosmos itself. The space between the stars is the deepest, coldest, most absolute emptiness in the natural world. It stretches between every sun and every living thing that has ever looked up from a warm surface and wondered whether the crossing could be made. Now you know the answer, and now you understand why it may never change.